When former U.S. President Donald Trump slapped harsh tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, Canada was cornered. Its biggest trading partner had suddenly turned hostile. Exports were crashing. Businesses were panicking. But this isn't a story of collapse. It's a story of resilience. Because when the U.S. shut its doors, Canada knocked on new ones. And what happened next? Surprised everyone. From Europe to Asia, a group of unexpected allies stepped up. They opened markets, signed deals, and kept Canada's economy moving when it needed it most. These are the 10 countries that helped pull Canada back from the brink and quietly reshaped its global future. Let's dive in. Number 10, European Union. A massive, wealthy bloc of 27 nations. What many forgot was that Canada had quietly signed a trade deal with the EU years earlier, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or CETA. When Trump's tariffs hit, Canada activated that deal like a switch. And what followed was nothing short of a trade miracle. Canadian exports to the EU soared, jumping more than 25%, reaching into the tens of billions of dollars. You'd be surprised how much Canadian seafood, aerospace technology, and medical devices are now being shipped across the Atlantic. Because when the US built walls, the EU opened doors, and Canada walked right through. The Trump tariffs could have triggered a crisis. Instead, they triggered a transformation. The European Union didn't just help Canada survive, it helped Canada thrive. Number 9, Indonesia. Southeast Asia's largest economy and one of the fastest-growing consumer markets in the world. At first glance, it wasn't the obvious choice, but Canada saw something others didn't. Behind the scenes, Canada and Indonesia accelerated trade talks, expanding bilateral deals and partnerships in key sectors like agriculture, energy, and technology. Indonesia needed Canadian wheat, lentils, and energy solutions. Canada needed access to Indonesia's vast markets for clean tech, education, and sustainable resources. And this wasn't just about big corporations. Small Canadian farms and manufacturers suddenly found opportunities in cities like Jakarta, Surabaya, and Medan. Trade between the two nations spiked. Canadian exports to Indonesia climbed to over $3.5 billion, and Indonesian investment in Canadian industries, from nickel processing to electric vehicle components, began to grow rapidly. The collaboration didn't stop at trade. Education, cultural exchange, and green energy innovation tied the two countries closer together. While the U.S. was building trade walls, Indonesia opened its doors. Canada walked through and found a new ally in an unexpected place. Number 8, Ecuador. Not a global powerhouse, not even in Canada's top 10 trading partners. But in 2025, Canada signed its 16th free trade agreement. And this time, it was with Ecuador, a country that had long flown under the radar in international trade. It wasn't just a random decision. While the world focused on the US, Canada was quietly forging new ties with countries like Ecuador. And why did this matter? Ecuador's potential lies in its growth sectors: agriculture, mining, and clean energy. It's rich in the very industries Canada wants to build up. And then there's the geography. Ecuador sits on key Pacific shipping routes, opening new trade avenues for Canadian products to flow into South America. And in return, Ecuadorian goods, from bananas to cacao to seafood, now have broader access to Canadian shelves. But here's the game changer. This deal with Ecuador is just the beginning. Canada has been expanding its network across Latin America, building 5 new trade relationships in under a decade. It's a move that sidesteps traditional trade dependencies and positions Canada in emerging markets that were once overlooked. So, what happens when a smaller trade partner opens the door to an entire region? What happens when these overlooked economies, like Ecuador, become the launching pads for Canada's future growth? It started with a small step, but Canada's bet on Ecuador is already paying off. And the best part? It's just getting started. Number 7, China. Amid tense diplomacy and global headlines, one of Canada's most complicated relationships quietly became one of its most valuable. Trade between Canada and China didn't just survive, it thrived. In 2024, Canadian seafood exports to China skyrocketed. Lobster, crab, and salmon became high-demand delicacies, with exports tripling to over $1.4 billion. But the growth didn't stop there. China's appetite for natural resources, energy, and agriculture lined up perfectly with what Canada had to offer. From canola oil to wood pulp, shipments across the Pacific surged, even as political tensions flared. While the U.S. turned inward with protectionist policies, Canada looked outward, and China answered. Chinese investors poured funds into Canadian clean energy projects, boosting wind, solar, and battery technology. Canadian universities also saw a wave of Chinese students, bringing in billions in tuition and strengthening cultural ties. Because at the heart of it, economics finds a way. China needed Canada's stable, high-quality resources. Canada needed a buyer that could replace lost U.S. demand. This wasn't just survival, it was smart strategy. Canada didn't wait for Washington to change course. It found new opportunity in Beijing, and that move helped stabilize entire industries back home. Number 6, Japan. While the headlines focused on U.S.-Canada tensions, something major was happening quietly across the Pacific. Canada and Japan were already partners under the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. But now that partnership took center stage. With U.S. trade routes under pressure, Canadian exporters pivoted east, and Japan, the world's third-largest economy, opened its doors. In 2024, Canadian beef exports to Japan jumped by over 45%. Japanese consumers, known for valuing high-quality meat, welcomed Canadian producers. But it wasn't just beef. Lentils, maple syrup, canola oil, seafood, all found growing demand in Japanese markets. Cut to B-roll: Canadian farms, Japanese grocery stores, container ships. Japan also saw opportunity. Japanese companies increased investment in Canadian energy and tech, from LNG projects in British Columbia to AI startups in Toronto. In return, Canada imported high-tech machinery, electronics, and vehicles, reinforcing a balanced, mutually beneficial relationship. And culturally, Japan and Canada have deepened ties through education and tourism. Japanese students returned to Canadian universities in larger numbers, and post-pandemic travel surged both ways, adding to the economic bond. Japan didn't just buy goods. It offered stability, reliability, and long-term partnership, something Canada needed when the U.S. turned inward. In global trade, flexibility is everything. And when Canada needed a new direction, Japan wasn't just an option, it was a lifeline. Number 5, South Korea. Canada's trade relationship with South Korea had already been growing, thanks to the Canada-Korea Free Trade Agreement signed back in 2014. But after the U.S. tariffs hit, it exploded. In just 1 year, Canadian exports to South Korea jumped by over 30%. South Korea became a top buyer of Canadian beef, seafood, lumber, and advanced agricultural products. And with its love for high-quality food and materials, Korea was a perfect match for Canadian exports. But this wasn't just about food. South Korea is a tech and innovation powerhouse, and it needed something Canada had: critical minerals, the building blocks of EV batteries, and clean energy. Suddenly, Canadian mining companies were securing deals with Korean firms. Battery partnerships were formed, clean energy projects launched, and the two countries began laying the foundation for a green tech alliance that could shape the future. Meanwhile, South Korea kept investing in Canada's education, its tech, and its people. Korean students returned to Canadian campuses. Researchers from both countries began teaming up in AI, biotech, and green innovation. Canada didn't just survive the trade crisis. It adapted, evolved, and built new bridges. South Korea wasn't just a trading partner, it became a strategic ally. Number 4, Mexico. Mexico was already a key player in North American trade, but when the tariffs came down, the relationship took on a whole new significance. Under the new USMCA agreement, Mexico became more than just a neighbor. It became one of Canada's most reliable trade partners. In the wake of the tariffs, Canada's agricultural products, like grains and meats, found a huge new market in Mexico. And it wasn't just food. Mexican manufacturers started importing Canadian tech, machinery, and even aerospace components. By 2020, Canadian exports to Mexico surged by over 40%. Mexico became one of Canada's fastest-growing trade partners, filling the gap left by the U.S. While the U.S. was pulling back, Mexico was rolling out the red carpet. But it wasn't just about trade. Mexico's proximity to Canada made it a crucial partner in logistics and supply chains. With fewer barriers and smoother trade routes, Mexico became the bridge that kept Canadian products flowing to international markets. In a time of uncertainty, Mexico's willingness to step in wasn't just about economics, it was about solidarity. And when the U.S. turned its back, Mexico showed Canada that sometimes the best partnerships aren't the ones you expect. The Philippines, a nation made up of over 7,000 islands, wasn't initially on Canada's radar as a major trade partner. But when the U.S. raised barriers, Canada saw an opportunity. Fast forward to 2024, and Canadian exports to the Philippines skyrocketed to over $2.3 billion, a staggering 35% increase in just 2 years. So, what's driving this surge? It's Canadian meat, wheat, and fertilizers, products in high demand across the archipelago. But it's not just about selling products. Filipino companies have also been ramping up investments in Canadian clean energy, technology, and educational services. What started as a one-way trade turned into a full-on partnership. The connection goes deeper than trade. The Philippines is now one of Canada's fastest-growing immigrant communities, creating strong cultural bonds that fuel business partnerships. Filipino students are flooding into Canadian universities, adding millions to the education sector and strengthening ties that go beyond economics. And here's the kicker. As China and other major players compete for influence in Southeast Asia, Canada is quietly expanding its presence. Filipino companies are now turning to Canadian partners for tech, food security, and even disaster response. The reason? Trust. The Philippines wasn't just a backup. It became a key player in Canada's global strategy, and this partnership is one to watch in the years to come. A country once associated with war and recovery quietly emerged as one of Canada's most important trade partners during this turbulent time. In 2024, Canadian exports to Vietnam skyrocketed, reaching over $1.60 billion, an impressive 40% increase in just 5 years. What caused this sudden surge? The answer lies in Vietnam's explosive growth. As the country's middle class expands and its manufacturing sector thrives, Vietnam became increasingly hungry for high-quality goods. And Canada, with its abundance of clean agri-food, seafood, lumber, and green energy technology, was ready to fill that need. Canadian products like beef, lentils, and dairy are now appearing on the shelves of Vietnamese supermarkets, strengthening trade ties in the region. But that's not all. Vietnam's economic boom isn't just about imports. It's about investment too. Vietnamese tech companies are now partnering with Canadian firms in clean energy projects across Ontario and British Columbia. Even the education sector is benefiting, with a growing number of Vietnamese students choosing to study in Canada. Vietnam's appeal as a trading partner goes beyond simple economics. As the country seeks to reduce its dependence on China and the United States, Canada has emerged as a stable, reliable alternative. With its established infrastructure, strong economic policies, and premium exports, Canada is rapidly becoming one of Vietnam's most trusted partners in the region. In the face of rising tariffs and trade tensions with the U.S., Canada took the opportunity to diversify its international relationships, and Vietnam was key in that strategy. The Vietnam-Canada partnership is more than just business. It's a testament to how strategic diplomacy and smart trade can turn challenges into opportunities. Number 1. Australia. Australia and Canada, two countries half a world apart but remarkably aligned. Both are resource-rich, innovation-driven, and committed to fair trade. Through the CPTPP, the two nations deepened their economic ties. By 2024, Canadian exports to Australia soared past $4.2 billion, up 30% since 2018. But this wasn't just about raw materials or food. It was smarter, deeper, touching industries like pharmaceuticals, mining technology, advanced manufacturing, and education. Why Australia? Because they needed each other. Australia was searching for reliable suppliers of clean, sustainable materials, things Canada excels at: high-grade lumber, rare earth elements, and advanced agri-tech. Meanwhile, Canada needed new, trusted partners as the U.S. turned inward. Australia offered just that, an English-speaking, regulation-friendly bridge into the booming Asia-Pacific. Canadian companies are quietly expanding operations in Sydney and Melbourne, not just for trade, but for reach. These cities are hubs, gateways to Southeast Asia. And the relationship doesn't stop at goods. Universities in both countries are forming dual-degree programs, increasing academic collaboration and fueling future economic synergy. And then there's the climate tech revolution. As both nations ramp up their commitments to net zero, they're not just trading, they're innovating together. Green hydrogen, carbon capture tech, sustainable farming, all of it is creating billion-dollar joint ventures that are shaping the next era of global commerce. So there you have it, 10 countries that didn't just trade with Canada. They rescued it from a potential economic hit. While the world focused on the clash between Canada and the US, these nations quietly stepped in, turned the tide, and helped Canada rewrite its place in global trade. This wasn't a setback. It was a setup for a smarter, stronger, more connected Canada. If you found this video informative, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, hit that bell icon so you never miss out on more insightful content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.